Good evening. My name is Rainer Kattel. I am professor and deputy director at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, and I will be chairing today's discussion, or as much as it is chairing, and rather let the people who know about citizenship in digital age. And so I will do a very brief introduction to the entire series, and then also to today's topic. And then we will have, as always, a very much a conversational style. So we won't have any presentations, but I will steer the conversation ever so slightly, ever so tenderly. And then, of course, at the end, we have an half an hour for your questions and interventions. But of course, if you hear something that you don't like at all, feel free to jump in the middle. Or if you hear something that you love, you can clap and let everybody know. And of course, we also welcome everybody on Facebook. Ironically, who's yes, we are live on Facebook. So yes. So everybody on Facebook and everybody later on YouTube, hello. It is true.
We have a hostile audience already.
We have a hostile audience. So you took too literally my encouragement. So, I mean, first of all, why do we have this series around innovation to welfare state? And last year we had a similar series around the public purpose in capitalist economy. And why are we in a British library? I think a lot of it is actually in our name. If you look at our name, Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is a really unusual combination, because most academic institutions are about economics, governance, chemistry, so there's big fields, and we try to put something together. And I think there is a very simple reason behind it, and that has to do with public value. So if you look at the dominant economic or governance frameworks that are used by governments or by economic or governance faculties around the world, do not actually have the term public value. We don't really talk about public value, which is perhaps ironic, and obviously something has been lost, because we talk very much around private value, private companies, private business, and we want to encourage them, and we want to at the same time public sector to be encouraging to them, but rather not take the risks itself. And this is of course something that we as an institute try to really debunk. So the idea that public value is actually fundamentally important and should be brought back into not only economics, but also, of course, into discussions of public policy, and especially, I think, into the discussion of data, where it is really, of course, that you have an entire sector of the economy that is dominated by large-scale private companies, yet we all consume and produce data every day, and we have so little say in that. And of course, if you want to read more, you can read on our website, and especially in Mariana's book, The Value of Everything, which really discusses the value of everything, both private and public. So I would not dwell more on it. But yeah, this year we talk about innovation and the welfare state. So we are really thinking about those two terms that are usually not seen together. So innovation seems something that is cool and sexy, and young people do it. Welfare state is something that those were weaker, and we have to help them somehow. And of course, our idea is that actually this is not true. We have to think of these things together, especially in the 21st century, when we want to rethink the successes of the welfare state from the point of view of the digital economy. So how can we bring the successes of the welfare state into the digital era, both in terms of education, transportation, healthcare, all that. And so that's why we put this together this series this year. And of course, we are in a British library that is one of those great, grand public institutions that has a public value remit. And of course, it's fantastic to work with them. And we have, after today, we have next week, this is our last discussion, which is around AI and public health. So even hotter topic than today, perhaps, because of course, everybody needs health, and everybody's excited about AI. So we are doing that next week with Ian Auger and other people. You have it on their chairs. Come next week as well, or watch it on Facebook or YouTube or whatever channel you like, if it's available. So today we are talking about empowering citizens through data. So we will talk about what does it mean to be a citizen in a digital age? And we will talk also a lot about cities, because cities are the context where everybody, every one of us, mostly experience the digital infrastructure, from our Google Maps to our Ubers to our everything. Of course, a lot of the sensors that are used for the digital economy are in the context of cities. So we are really experiencing the data economy very often in a context of cities. And as you know, more than half of the world by now lives in cities. So we'll talk both about citizenship, but also increasingly, I think, about cities. So today we have two really wonderful people here with me. So we have, first of all, Francesca Bria, who is from Italy, but comes now from Barcelona. She has been, for a number of years, a chief digital officer in the city of Barcelona, has been one of the globally leading innovators, I think, in this era, and has been recognized by various journals and rankings and lists that have been put you on the top 50, this and that. So it's really wonderful to have you here. And of course, Francesca has I'm sure she will talk more about Barcelona and her experience in Barcelona over the last years, which can be seen really as a global trailblazer, especially in the area of citizen and data, and trying to include citizens more and actually gaining the data back to citizens. And of course, Francesca has also a longer history here in London. You have studied here, you worked here in Nesta, so she's also half Londoner, we can say. And to my yes, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, she also is IIPP visiting professor, which should be, of course, a number one item that I should mention to you. Jaideep Gupte is unfortunately not visiting professor with us, but he is a researcher at the Institute for Development Studies at Sussex University. And his research is very much around cities and data in Global South. So this is a very different, but sometimes not so different perspective on issues of cities and data. And he also has another hat, which is working for the UKRI, which is the UK's research council, where he is also in charge of and steering research projects around those issues. So both our speakers today have an academic and practitioner background. So if you have more theoretical questions or more practical questions, they can answer both. So don't
obviously.
be obviously, yes, exactly, because they both have PhDs. I see here, so that must mean something. So, without further ado, I would like to start our discussion from a very philosophical question, but I hope you will both bring very practical angles to that. And the first question really is around, what does it mean to be a citizen in the digital age? Does it actually change much, or not yet that much, or is it all around Facebook and votes and us being influenced, or are there any real practical implications as well? Because there's so often we hear about smart cities that sort of assumes that citizens are dumb, so that we need to have to make cities around citizens smarter. Is that really the case, and what are the sort of undercurrent ideas that we have to face? So, Francesca.
Great. So first of all, hello everybody. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's great for me to be here at the British Library and in this lecture series, which is about rethinking the welfare state, because I think this kind of conversation are about creating new alliances, new practical alternatives to move forward, putting people's rights at the center of the digital age, and reimagining a future welfare really requires people coming together from the kind of public sector, trade unions, citizens groups, private sector, and really putting our thoughts together on what we need as alternatives to what we have. And since Facebook has already been mentioned 3 or 4 times, and we we had a hostile audience comment. Let me just build on that as a start, just to say that maybe in the future, then after this lecture series, I hope that we will be broadcasting this series in an independent infrastructure, public infrastructure, for creating knowledge that the British Library obviously should have, that is not Facebook, that preserves our rights, our right to privacy, our information self-determination, so on, so on, so on. So maybe we make this as an outcome of this lecture series, very practical. So going into the topic, so I think I want to put forward a couple of thoughts on this big, broader question of what it means to be a citizen in the digital age. So I think we are observing two trends that are important for us, also working in cities, very close to citizens at the moment. And thanks for saying I'm Italian, but work in the Catalan government. I think I'm the only foreigner working at the moment in the Catalan government, which is a great experience. But proud to be Italian, by the way. And yeah, so the trends, kind of, no, because everybody's bashing Italy nowadays. So I actually like to say proud to be Italian. Okay, so yeah. So the kind of trends that we are experiencing, I think, is on one side, people are really losing trust in public institutions, and they're losing trust also in the ability of the public sector, the state, the government, to have answers to the more pressing social problems and needs. And this is obviously linked to a crisis of legitimacy of, I mean, many people are talking about a crisis of legitimacy of the liberal order today, but also a crisis of political representation. And I think this is linked to the fact that many governments cannot give concrete answers to, for instance, affordable housing, the questions around the climate change and climate emergency, questions around migration, questions around inequalities in the world, wage stagnation, the problems that we have in the economy. And there is a kind of breakdown of trust. And so this leads me to maybe, I think the right question is not how to be a citizen or what it means to be a citizen, but what is a new social contract in the digital age, or at least in this current moment. On the other side, I think the big question is the rise of big tech accelerating the social, political and economic crisis that we live, or is it giving some hope or some positive answers? And I argue here that I think what we're seeing is that big tech, and by big tech I mean the big technology giants, which are mainly on one side from Silicon Valley, so the Alphabet, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, the big companies, and of course the rise of the Chinese technology companies, which have a combined market value of over $3 trillion US, so an unparalleled concentration of power and market power and social power, are posing threats and challenges that are not only technical, but they are of an existential kind. They are big challenges that need to be answered with ambitious policies around, for instance, questions over monopoly power, questions over, do we need a new taxation system? Are we able to tax these companies? Is there a difference on how we tax normal corporations and the big digital platforms? Questions around unemployment due to automation. Is this a problem of the robots stealing our jobs, or is this a problem of the business model of these companies and maybe our inability to tax those companies? Until questions that regards our privacy, civil liberties, breaches over trust that are leading to a decreased trust in liberal democracy, or at least a decreasing faith in liberal democracy, which is leading in many countries around the world, including here in the UK, I'm afraid, to right-wing populists going to power. And so in front of this situation, on one side, the political system seeming unable, or at least nation states, unable to give answer to the pressing social problems. The other side, big tech, which seems to accelerate this political and economic crisis, I think citizens feel that they are basically left without a new social pact, a new social contract, without a deal, and that basically the reaction can be getting disenfranchised and don't believe that, why do I vote? Why do I have to believe in the system? And so voting right-wing populism. Or, and here is the good news, we can put forward alternatives like it is happening in many cities around the world, where I think at the moment, because of the proximity to citizens and because we have actually leaders in cities that are pretty progressive and inclusive and have a pragmatic leadership, I think that we see that some cities around the world are trying to give some alternatives that is not less democracy but more democracy. And then within that we have to see how the digital, or what we call the digital, which means how connectivity, big data, and artificial intelligence and mass computation, which basically mediates a lot of the things in the economy, in government and in society, how do we gain this back for the people?
Thanks.
Thanks, Francesca. And I guess to start, Rainer and Mariana, thanks for inviting me here. It was so wonderful to be part of this series, and particularly to be invited with Francesca, because it makes my job easier, right? I just agree with whatever she says, and then keep quiet.
We have to disagree a bit.
We'll find something to disagree on by the end of the evening. But I think, Francesca, you categorized or reformulated the question correctly. I think it is about the social contract. I think that's the way to understand how citizens, and I sort of use the NAF way of spelling citizen, right? CITYZENS. So for me, the city is a deeply meaningful lens to start interrogating some of these questions. And so understanding what the social contract looks like, how it's changing from the perspective of citizens, is, I think, a deeply meaningful question. It goes well beyond Facebook. It goes well beyond social media. And in a number of ways, right? And so particularly from the perspective of the global south, and that's a term I'll use fairly often, but that you can take it to mean developing country contexts, you can take it to mean contexts that are different from contexts that you are accustomed to, or you can take it to mean contexts that you are more accustomed to, right? So this is also a term that I'm very open to interpretation. But from those perspectives of the global south, the social contract has come to be deeply meaningful, for instance, from the perspective of India, because since electronic voting has become a thing, right? It is literally the fundamental way you lay claim to the city, is through data. Right? You go press a button and your vote is registered. Very unlike here, actually. We're, some would say, years ahead. In a shanty, in a slum in Mumbai, you go, there's a electronic voting booth set up, all the parties are listed, and you press buttons and it prints out the symbol of the party that you've voted for, so you can check that your vote is being, there's immediate checking. So in some ways, the digital space has directly connected the citizen with their rights. But I think that's a very on-the-surface way to look at it, because data processes, data infrastructures have also been deeply disempowering. Right? So data is the key tool. In fact, it's a weapon that those in power use to disenfranchise citizens, particularly those that are already marginalized, right? Those that are already living in precarious areas, working in precarious areas. And an example of how this is done. Right? So you would have all been fairly familiar with the image of the sea of slums. Right? So you have these aerial photographs showing, say, Mumbai or Lagos or any of these primate cities of the global south with, from end to end, you just see informal settlements. And that kind of data, right, that does have a great deal of basis to it, because in a city like Mumbai, 12 to 18 million people, half of the city lives in informal settlements, like 6 to 9 million people. So it is an enormous number of people. But that data is used to trigger eviction drives, to trigger demolitions across vast areas of high dense living under this narrative that the slum is taking over the city. Right? The informal spaces that you see behind me are somehow parasitic on the city. But if you look at this question from a different point of view, from different data points, what you see is, for instance, in terms of land use, that informal settlements in a city like Mumbai only occupy about 6% of the land. Right? So half of the city is living on 6% of the land, whereas the other half has 94% of the land. Right? When you look at it in those terms, you can see how narratives can be completely shaped to mean something very different and actually used as a tool to disenfranchise people, to push them out of urban space. There's also bigger questions. Francesca, you alluded to some of the issues that the data economy, data infrastructures haven't tackled yet. And to me, the big ones are solid waste management. Right? We produce about 2 billion tons of solid waste. It's going to increase by about 70% in the coming decades. That's an enormous amount of solid waste. And already cities in the south are spending about 60 to 70% of their municipal budgets on figuring out how to deal with their solid waste. That's a map. The colored areas are where the informal settlements are in Mumbai. The white areas are so-called formal areas, right? So how we deal with our shit, excuse my language, is a question that the data economy hasn't figured out. And I can talk about more examples later on as we go through. Affordable housing, you mentioned, that's a deep crisis in developing country contexts, particularly in cities as well. And here, the problem is so similar between a London and a Lagos, right? People being evicted from space that is rightfully theirs, but not monetarily theirs. And unfortunately, the data economy, I think, proves Habermas wrong. We are being more technocratic than democratic.
I think that's a really, really good point to try to hone in on something that I think we both mentioned. You started with the social contract, that we need a new social contract. And I think I absolutely agree, and probably everybody in the space agrees with that. And I think the question is, how do we get there? It's both, as you said, it's the power of big companies, incumbent companies, but it's also really about what kind of institutions would we need to actually make this digital age social compact actually work. Because obviously there is not enough what we have today, either in the context of Mumbai or context of London or Barcelona. So in that sense, I would slightly try to push back and say, what should we actually do to get a new social contract?
Well, I would argue that the social contract that we need is going to be built bottom up. So it's going to be built starting from cities. And the point, I think, is connected to first, I think at some level, as I said before, the crisis of legitimacy of nation states at some level. But also, I think because it is about a lot of the things that you also mentioned, that is basically regaining power or shifting the power back to the people. And I think that because the questions that the data economy, or let's just call it the economy, I mean, because this is also, I think, the problem that, we tend to talk about digitization and the digital as if it's something that is disconnected from the economy, labor market, jobs, society, government. And then we have the digital. And the digital, you can only discuss it with the technologists or the technocrats or Google or Facebook or whatever. No. I mean, this is the economy today, and it happens to be very digitized, very financialized as well, and also mediated by the key infrastructures of our times. Some of them are mass computation, data, and then artificial intelligence, and all of it. And so I think then we need to link it up to what it actually is, what's changing in society. So I think the new social contract would require institutions that are built from the ground up, because we need to rebalance the question of power, but also I think because of the basic question of trust. So you can, in fact, in the neighborhood, you can pose very concrete questions. So, for instance, let's link it to the whole debate around smart cities, right? And the question of what is a digital city. So in the common understanding, a kind of smart city, actually in the common understanding it doesn't exist, because I think if we ask around in this room what is a smart city, nobody knows and nobody is interested about it. Because they don't understand how the smart city is affecting, their exactly affordable housing, access to food, sustainable mobility, fight against climate change, access to public space, education, and so on. So it is kind of disconnected, and I think the problem is because it has been pushed as a marketing name, actually probably branded, even patented, by the tech giants that, of course, were pitching to cities that were in crisis, mostly public debt or private debt shifted to the public, and they couldn't afford to invest in basic infrastructure and services, and so the big companies were telling the cities, okay, buy our services, externalize a lot of the things that you used to do in governments, and externalize a lot of knowledge systems and infrastructure and software and so on. And then we create these cities in a black box. We run everything through our operating system, we gather all the data, we have the infrastructure, and then we'll sell it back to you. And obviously this is not going to result in cheaper, affordable, more universal services for citizens. And then we have the disconnect where we cannot show how this is improving the life of citizens. So what we decided to do in Barcelona was to shift the narrative upside down and say, we are not going to start top-down technology first, we are not going to start talking about sensor, blockchain, connectivity, AI, or whatever buzzword is coming up, but we're going to start talking about what people really need. Affordable housing, sustainable mobility, more public space, more education, and only after we're going to ask how can technology and data, if governed in a democratic way that puts citizens right at the center, help us to tackle these big challenges that we have. And the way we've got there, and that's why, again, what kind of institutions do we need? I think they have to start from the ground up, is through a participatory democracy process. And this has been, I think, somehow courageous. So you need to elect in government courageous leaders which have the ability to put themselves into question, but to say the problem, it's not only that citizens are not participating, that citizens are dumb, that citizens don't know what they need, that citizens... No. Actually, the problem is that the institutions that we have are not equipped and not able to integrate the collective intelligence of citizens, what they do, into the way we take public decisions. So actually, we have to say, change the public institutions to integrate this collective action, this collective intelligence of citizens. That's what we tried to do. We did a large-scale participatory democracy process. 400,000 citizens participated into shaping the agenda of the city of Barcelona. 70% of the proposals, which are today our government plan, came directly from citizens. And obviously this was not at all a Facebook democracy. Actually, it was like the most distant to what you can imagine. As a click here, having this process is governed by a multinational companies where you have no accountability. It has been a hybrid with online democracy and offline democracy, meaning, neighborhood by neighborhood, engaging people from different ethnic background, different socio-economic background, different gender, different age, and then, going there prioritizing the policy agenda of the city. And then you end up with a program and with ways to involve citizens into also managing some of those services that really are much more people-centric in a way. So you basically flip the smart city rhetoric, and then all the questions are about governing the digital infrastructures of the city and governing data, which we'll discuss later.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Jaideep, I would like to ask you, how do we make sure But these kind of processes can take place also in cities where you don't have, let's say, this kind of strong democratic tradition, and also the citizenship that is actually really willing to go out there and participate. So how do we make sure that we don't have this sort of a gentrified version of that in other places?
That's a fascinating question that's been, driving a lot of my sort of research energies for quite some time now. And it actually revolves around something you mentioned, Francesca, about how people define smartness. Because obviously in the literature, as academics, we know this is a big question that keeps coming up. What is smart? Because you need to know what smartness is to then advise cities, or the cities themselves need to know. So what's the way to do this? You would have seen a slide that came up earlier. And my sort of way to get around this is to think about mangoes. So how many of you know about mangoes? How many varieties, by show of hand, who thinks that there are 10 different varieties of mangoes? Who thinks there's 100 varieties of mangoes? All right. 500 varieties? Wow, here we go. 1,000 varieties? No? Wow, you all are wrong. There's literally thousands of varieties of mangoes, right? Yeah, Marina, you were the closest. And the reason that this analogy works really well for me is that, there's thousands of varieties. India has about 300 varieties of mangoes alone. And there's some that are super expensive. They're super manicured. They look very pretty, but taste absolutely bland. Right? And then there's completely everyday varieties that are very gnarly and you wouldn't pick them up off a shelf, but have mind-blowing flavor. And to me, that's quite emblematic of the smart cities debate, because you need to look at local perspectives, local understandings of what smartness is as the starting point, not the end point. You can't arrive at some sort of a top-down vision of what localness is. And here's a point, perhaps, Francesca, the only point that we may disagree, is I love your example from Barcelona. I love your city. I love your mayor. I think it's a wonderful situation to be in. You're quite lucky.
Can all move to Barcelona if you want.
But I think the one downside of cities like Barcelona is that we tend to forget that there are equal, perhaps not in the same level, but there is innovation happening in the global south as well, and that sometimes gets drowned out, right? You maybe pick out some innovation in Mumbai or Lagos, but you hold it up as like an exotic mango. You put it in a museum, you look at it, but you don't look to replicate it. We all strive to replicate Barcelona's, and to me, that's a bit of an issue. So we actually me and my team spent this summer going through every single piece of evidence published in the English language over the last 10 years about data governance, right? So we took it as a starting point that you need data for governance. What we were looking for is how that data is being governed. Right? Two separate things. And we wanted to know what evidence there is from the global south. And we had a machine-run algorithm that looked through about 200 million peer-reviewed articles. We had all kinds of different ways of picking things out, and we found really interesting things, right? So one was that people were using the word smart in very many different ways, and data was a descriptor that was used in tandem with the word smart quite often, which we expected. But three things came up that we didn't quite expect. One was that when we group the global south together, still the evidence is only coming from a handful of countries, and largely from China, even though we only searched in English, right? And we didn't actually, so we missed out on all the Chinese literature, we missed out on the Latin American literature, the Francophone literature. China, India, Brazil, to some extent, dominate the evidence, right? We're not quite sure what that means. Does that mean there isn't innovation happening in the other spaces, or does that just mean as academics we're not being interested in these issues in some of the other countries? That was one. The second finding was that the neighborhood was completely missing, right? The beating heart of any city was, to me, missing from this evidence of what smartness is, how people are using or governing data. And that, to me, was odd, because most of the evidence was either at the national level and largely at the multi-city level. So people were trying to compare what's happening in Barcelona or somewhere. Well, not Barcelona, because we focused on the global south, but it was at a city-to-city level. The neighborhood was missing. And then finally, and perhaps most poignantly, and to me quite depressing bit of finding, was that we had absolutely no evidence on how institutions of data governance were changing. And we know that can't be true. The institutions are changing, right? We all started with this point. There's so much change happening. So why aren't we spotting this evidence, at least in a peer-reviewed sort of space? Are we looking for the wrong type of innovation? Are we looking for stuff largely on data quality rather than institutional change? That to me is depressing, because it's institutions that make innovation stick.
Yeah, exactly. I think we can really continue from the point of view where you both sort of gravitated towards. You sort of about economy, actually. So that you talked about innovation, you talked about the need to actually talk about the economy as a whole and see where can we go next, essentially. And as we started off, that we are live streamed on Facebook rather than on British Library's own media. So my next set of questions is around the idea of the return of industrial policy that we see now happening here in UK, but we also see it happening in US and all other places. But we see it also happening both across the political divide. So you can argue that Donald Trump is a form of, or exercising form of industrial policy through his tariff policies. You have Marco Rubio and others talking about it. So what is the role, and at the same time, as we were saying, I mean, British Library is not using its own processing technology. We use Facebook. We use Uber rather than Transport for London's apps for these kind of sort of technologies and products. So there's obviously a really big shift going on in terms of, as you mentioned as well, that there is a private big companies that are really getting to space with themselves. So what is the role of cities, but also citizenship and all this social compact in this new industrial policy space, or what it should be actually, because it's not there yet, I guess.
Okay, let me maybe answer first to your question, but then I would really like to get to some concrete examples of how we're doing it, what we're doing, because I think it's important for people to understand what is possible in this space. So I think I will answer the question of big industrial policies from a city perspective immediately. So for us, for instance, at the moment, with all the debate that you read in the newspapers about a trade war between the US and China, which is actually a technology and geopolitical war, with US orders that are starting banning specific technologies coming from China in critical components of critical infrastructures when it comes to processors and 5G and supercomputing. I think you start understanding, how, first of all, that we may be seeing at the moment a kind of breakdown of the global technology supply chain, some breakdown already happening here. Which is a big deal, because until now we've been, thinking that the global internet works for everybody. Although it is run largely by US corporations and by the US military and the US, state commerce, we thought this is good for everybody and we have global standards. And now at the moment, because we have an hegemonic war between two contenders of the digital supremacy, I would say, we start realizing that the situation is more complex and that actually technology, it is about geopolitics and it is about commercial power. So for cities, for us, for instance, that we're building the next generation infrastructures, 5G, it's something that we are rolling out in every city across the board. And for us, 5G, it's something really important because on top of 5G, we're going to build, and we are building, the urban infrastructure for transportation. We are building water management systems. We are building the next generation industrial system for our SMEs locally. Of course, all the data gets collected by these giant players, and you have to start thinking, you know, who has access to the data and for doing what. And then, of course, you also start thinking, oh, all of a sudden you cannot buy any more equipment from Huawei, or you cannot rely on processors that, you know, for the data. So what do we do? And I think there, I mean, my problem is that, of course, we understand that it lacks a little bit ambition from the EU that hasn't set its own industrial policy, and it doesn't say we have to regain control of critical infrastructure and take back some technological sovereignty, because otherwise we cannot have our own independent economic policy, and also we will struggle to set the rules of the game, meaning you cannot have regulation that is advanced, for instance, like the GDPR in Europe, and say, right, we want to have human rights, we want to have privacy, security, and ethics by design, we want to protect workers' rights, we want to protect our citizens' rights. But since we do not control the underlying critical infrastructures, and we do not control the hardware, the software, the data, and nothing, we have to rely on the likes of Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple, by the way, all privately controlled corporations of a big company, and ask them, can you please? And this is not happening, obviously. And I think this is my problem in all the debate, you know, regarding regulation around antitrust, which obviously I think it's needed and it is good, but probably not enough. I mean, meaning that if you really want to have, you know, democratic, I mean, maybe you have to regain democratic control over this infrastructure and have your own industrial policy and be ambitious, and then say, okay, let's agree maybe globally on the kind of standards and the kind of rules, and try to govern this situation. So this is like my take on what is happening at on the big picture and the big level, and I think this is really, I mean, from cities, the pressure should be at the level of the European Commission, because if Europe doesn't move on these issues, we definitely cannot do it alone. I mean, meaning that no matter how fantastic the story of Barcelona will be about, you know, investing our 80% of our IT budget in free and open source software, controlling data and regaining back data sovereignty, try to build open, decentralized privacy enhancing infrastructure, yes, but we need the power of Europe behind, and we need to do it fully if we are serious about it.
Just a bit, I mean, because I think maybe you can talk a bit about also the case of Libre that you just mentioned before we started, because it's, I think it's such a wonderful...
Let's heat it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, so Barcelona has been pioneering a project that's called Decode, and it has been funded with, I mean, actually, it's still going on, and is a 5 million investment from the European Commission to build alternative to surveillance capitalism, meaning build decentralized, privacy-enhancing, and rights-preserving data infrastructure to give back data sovereignty to citizens and create public value through data. So we are building this infrastructure, and we are running experiments in Amsterdam, Barcelona, and across Europe, which I can tell you more about it. But what happened is that through the project, we were developing really interesting cryptographic protocols that would enable citizens to be the one that decide what data they want to keep private, what data they want to share, with whom, and on what terms, and these terms will be set in a democratic way. And what happened is that the core team, the development team that was developing this new decentralized protocol, was bought by Facebook entirely and shipped to Palo Alto. I mean, of course, what they offer in terms of salary vis-a-vis to UCL, actually is UCL development group in the computer science department, is 3, 4 times, 5 times more. I am not sure about the salary, but anyway, this is more or less what is at stake. And so the engineers are there now leading the technology, some of the technology part of the Facebook Libre, which is all over the news right now, which is Facebook attempt to develop their own crypto global currency based on distributed ledger technology, permission distributed ledger built by Facebook. And so, you know, after the news, of course, because we've been entirely funding this team for 2.5 years with European taxpayers' money from the European Commission. I called the European Commission. I was like, okay, we may want to sell it as great news. Of course, we're building next generation technologies that are the best, and that's why Facebook is buying them. But how do we deal with that? Because, I mean, we want to create public value with this investment. We want to have public return. And if the entire team, I mean, if you cannot compete on keeping the talent here and help us building this privacy-preserving infrastructure that we badly need, for our digital society, we badly need these alternatives. But now it's feeding Facebook monster, which of course is, Facebook is saying we're going to create more public value, it's going to be more decentralized, it's going to be cryptographic and secure, but it's centrally controlled by Facebook, and it will continue to their business model, which is the problem.
Exactly. This is, I think, where the industrial policy debate is actually much more relevant than perhaps we realize, because all of this undercurrent that is going on, that these big companies being able to suck all the talent actually in the world, especially in areas like AI, which is really heating up. And I wanted to ask you as well.
And sorry, to just go also to you, is because we are becoming a digital colony. But this is also interesting how I think, you know, the debate is strongly shifting. You know, if you look at the role of China and India and the role of Asia in this space, I mean, Facebook with Libre, they are, I mean, because the debate now is Facebook, I mean, China is only copying American companies and they're stealing our IP. Actually, if you look at WeChat and if you look at Alipay, this is what Facebook is copying. It's actually a reverse process. And so we are now the digital colony. I'm sorry to say, but Europe really risks to be a digital colony in this debate.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask from you, Jaideep, as well, is you know, because you can look at it in many ways. You can argue that the global south has been weakened over the last decades by the World Trade Organization rules. So the policy space for industrial policy has been getting smaller and smaller. But at the same time, you have players like China who are able to use the space they have. And so I would like to ask from your perspective as well, the rise of industrial policy.
Sure, and I agree, right? The geographies of north-south, south-north aren't very clear, they're complex, and the way things are linked is deeply meaningful, right? There's a stat out there that we've got 10 times the amount of internet cable as we do in kilometers of borders, so we're more connected than we are disaggregated. This world, so all of these kinds of geographies are complex. On the question of industrial strategy, and this is actually a space where I'm reading your work and Mariana's work to understand this area a bit more. But I think there's two value adds from the perspective of the Global South. The first is that there needs to be an urban or a city element to any industrial strategy, right? You said it yourself, half of humanity lives in cities, but the bit about the Global South is that 95 or I think 98% of urban growth is going to happen in the Global South, right? There's cities in the so-called North are fairly stagnant in terms of population growth. All the movement is happening in the South. The second is informality. So, as I said, half of the city of Mumbai lives in informal spaces, but even one slum in one city of Mumbai, Dharavi, has an annual turnover of about $1 billion, right? Because of all the informal industry that's situated there. Informality is not a side issue. It's the absolute core of the way the world economy works at the moment. And we're not just talking about the dark gray areas of sort of illegality, paralegality. This is like, a lot of the wallets you guys might probably, the leather wallets you have in your pockets at the moment probably come or have been manufactured in a slum, a completely informal setting. But it's not just citizens that are being informal. There's some fantastic work by an urbanist called Gautam Bhan in India who sees the state as being informal. Right? So he has categorized urban practice in 3 ways. So he says the state, the southern way of practicing in the urban environment, so your southern counterparts, do 3 things. They squat, right? So the state controls urban space by essentially squatting on places for years and decades and then claiming it. Right? They don't build, but they essentially repair. Right? There's not much building, and there's not really any upgrading either. It's essentially repairing. And then there isn't large sort of macro provision of services. It's all consolidation of a mishmash of small, informal, private, hybrid services that make cities happen. And this sort of largely can be categorized as what informality is. And I think, therefore, industrial strategy needs to figure out what it's going to say about the informal economy. And to that, I possibly take it one step forward. And this is, largely just thinking out aloud, and you guys can completely tear down my ideas. But I wonder if the main innovation of our times is informality. Right? If you think about informality as people's response to the crises that they face to make their life just incrementally better, to be able to live their life in a city, for the state to be able to practice under the types of governance arrangements that are at play, then to me, informality is the most innovative entity that humans have come up with in these few years. And so industrial strategy needs to think about how it deals with cities and how it deals with informal cities.
Absolutely. You want to react to the informality aspect, or?
I agree.
You agree? You're too nice. Anyway, but I want to get to the last part of our discussion, which has been, through all of those questions where we have discussed, there is an assumption about the state or the public sector as such, I think, which we have assumed that the public sector needs to have perhaps a stronger role than it has now. Yeah. We talked about leadership, that we need to elect charismatic leaders who are able to actually bring the agenda forward. But I would also like to ask, from the perspective of public organizations, again, both from the North and the South perspective, what is that we need to have in these organizations themselves, whether we need to rethink them in some ways to deal with the challenge of the changing economy, but also the take up really the challenge of industrial policy in the way we just discussed it both on the level of European Union, Spain, Barcelona. We need all of those levels to be engaged in industrial policy discussions, but not just industrial policy as it used to be in a very vertical sense, but really much more in an inclusive way. So what is that the public organizations themselves need to rethink?
Yeah. Well, let me clarify one thing when it comes to data, because this has been is a topic, obviously, of this conversation, and the role of the state. Because I think we have to also rethink what it means, for instance, to have public ownership over data in this moment. Yeah. So my position here is that we cannot oppose to the private monopoly, the private data monopoly, a vision of it should be the state that controls citizen data. I think that this it's an error. I think it's not gonna work, and I think it's not what people want, and it doesn't create the kind of collective awareness that we need to solve the problems that we're facing. So I think we have to reimagine hybrid models where obviously it is required the public ownership, maybe of part of the infrastructure altogether. So I think that we can imagine part of this infrastructure could be, data infrastructure itself, to have a component that should be publicly owned. And in particular, setting the rules that could be data sharing mandates for big digital platforms, which with the power of the state, you oblige companies to share data to make sure that SMEs, that cooperatives, that trade unions, that citizens themselves can have access to a resource that should be a common good, and it shouldn't just be a private commodity. You can then have, of course, very strict rules about what you can do and what you cannot do with personal data. And I think this is what we are getting closer to that with the GDPR that mandates data portability, information self-determination of people, autonomy, and privacy, security, and ethics by design. So that, you know, it's establishing some kind of sovereignty, individual sovereignty over their data. And then I think we can move into a model of really commons, data commons, where what it means is that data can be governed by the individual and by communities. So you can set specific rules where you say, I mean, this shouldn't be the state that decide, you know, what data I need to keep private, what data I need to share, what is the benefit of it, but it can be individuals through distributed privacy-enhancing technologies that we have today and legal rules that should be enforced by the technology itself to decide what data they want to keep private, and then we need cryptographic protocol. So we need to start as a society to understand that encryption and cryptography is a human right, that we have to know how to use it, that it's in our right to have it simple, and that, you know, public institutions should be the custodians of this right, so it should make it by default. So now it's the other way around. I mean, you have to choose all these. Now, basically, the rules are set by the corporations, and you as a citizen have to know everything in order to control your privacy. I mean, this is ridiculous. So this has to shift. And I imagine, and in Barcelona, we're betting on a model where citizens more and more are in control over their data. But this is enabled by a public infrastructure and by the stepping in of the public sector to ensure that these rights are there. So I just want to make this clear because sometimes, you know, people say, oh, okay, I don't trust Facebook and Google with my data, but I also don't trust the state. And I don't want government to decide. And obviously, I agree. Don't trust. I mean, we should not really trust. That's the thing. And I think so that is the question that I think we have to imagine new institutions for common data or data commons that are a hybrid of public infrastructure, decentralized data governance with citizens' control, granular control over data, and then data sharing mandates and collaboration with private sector. And this has to be in place, and at the moment it's not in place. So I didn't answer to your question, but I just wanted to clarify, and because then on top of this data, of course, if then you open up this data, then you can start imagining. I mean, I just end my reasoning with this concrete example. The reason why in Barcelona we are having these conversations around data sovereignty is not because, you know, Catalan people are super advanced technologically, they're all cryptographers and they care about their data and their crypto. I mean, no, it's because they started thinking about these issues because of Uber and Airbnb. Yeah. Because all of a sudden, people that are absolutely non-technological understood that digital platforms had a very big impact on their price of their rent and the right to housing and the right to public mobility and public transportation. And all of a sudden, these questions about who controls the data and the critical infrastructure of our society, because it affects public housing and mobility and public space, it became general conversation that we're trying to integrate in the policy that we do in our city. So I want to make this clear.
Yeah, from your perspective.
From my perspective, so what can we do to enable cities to make data the currency for empowerment, right? I mean, the simple answer is to clone Francesca and put her in 100 different cities, and then those cities will be good to go. Every time I've entered a municipal office, I don't see local authorities. I see like urban guerrilla fighters, right? They're constantly firefighting. You'll see this, and this is what brings cities in the north and south together. you'll have a data officer who's responding to media queries, who's responding to a crisis that's happened in a sewage plant, who's talking about the big issues the mayor is about and wants to know the big health plan for the city. There's such amount of expectation placed on a deeply under-resourced environment. And so what happens, right? The end of financial year is coming up. There's pressures to also spend the municipal budget. And these local authorities who've been hired for a very specific set of duties, the easiest thing for them to do is to open their doors to the big corporates who come with end-to-end solutions, right? The IBMs, the Oracles, the HPs. They say, yeah, we'll solve all your problems. Just one monthly payment that the mayor will handle, the government will, you don't need to worry about it, just sign, just say that you need this. And then we end up in the spaces that we are in, where it's become almost the thing to do, or the easiest way out. In fact, it's the only option often for these cities to opt for these big end-to-end solutions. And there's, that crowds out people here, actually. So there's small and medium enterprises in the UK that produce sensors, that produce switches, that want to enter the global market, that want to be producing stuff for smart cities in India, but they're just completely crowded out, right, by these big companies. But so what can we do? I think there's something about trust here, because data isn't simply generated by the big companies. Slum dwellers are generating their own data at the moment. There's slum dweller federations the world over gathering data on the services they have or don't have, the quality of housing, where they're living in the city. If you want to know more, there's a great website called knowyourcity.tv that is put together by Slum Dwellers International. Slum dwellers in Asia, across Africa, Latin America are mapping their own cities. And in fact, I've produced a small film that's on that website called No One Left Behind, where the idea was that instead of looking at reams of official data on homicide, on violent crime, we just asked slum dwellers, what does it mean to live a violence-free life? What would you do to make your slum better? And that's what the film's about. So have a look. So instead of sort of strengthening cities to create new data or to teach slum dwellers how to do their data, we just need to get cities to trust the data that slum dwellers are already creating.
Absolutely. So before you go, all of you go and move to Barcelona or go watch Jaideep's movie, you can ask questions. Oh, yeah, so we'll take 3 questions at a time, and or 3 persons. You might have more questions than one, and then we go around again. And once you get the microphone, please stand up because you're being filmed, of course, for the Facebook, so not for the British Library, unfortunately. So, Mariana, you want to go first?
So can I just say 4 things you've said? One is this interesting word of publicly funded infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You've also talked about bottom-up, which I have no idea what that means. You've talked about skepticism and not trusting the state. And we've implied through the word monopoly that there's serious profits being earned. And I think we all know that the profit share is at record levels, the labor share is at very low level. So my question is, where are movements and organizations like, for example, the trade union movement, the labor movement, the green movement, currently Extinction Rebellion, for example, which is the most modern form of that, in your narrative? Because I think there's this fuzzy word, the city, and fuzzy word, the citizen, which kind of lets us pass over things like, whether it's class or other things, which maybe are part of the solution. I mean, some of the biggest advances in our time, from the emergence of the welfare state to other forms of social contracts, have occurred not to talk about the citizen, mm-hmm. as though that means anything. Mm-hmm. So the mafia, the Italian Cosa Nostra, mm-hmm. was a citizen movement, bottom up, in reaction mm-hmm. to the mistrust against the state. Mm-hmm. So there's a real danger. You talked about populism, that this narrative, this mm-hmm. mistrust on the state, unless you really refine that that discussion to we need to rethink what is the state, how can it really represent citizens, and put your emphasis, as by the way you're doing. I actually think you're doing that. I just think some of your narrative can really be captured in this kind of populist thing that you talked about in the beginning, unless you refine the categories.
Next. Yeah. Person over there. Sorry.
Yes, so I think based on everything that we heard in the discussion, I didn't hear much about what should actually be the actionable, active, and conscious effort from the public sector to create systemic education policies to close the knowledge and education gap that exists particularly in these fields. The reason why data and technology and STEM fields are so commodified is particularly because it's become to only the 5% of the population that know about these things. So when we talk about empowering the citizen, most of it has been always still a few people owning the data and the interpretation and then helping the city understand it rather than the citizen itself understanding on its own. So how can we actually create systemic education policies to close these innovation and knowledge gaps and empower the citizens?
Thank you. And I think there was somebody there. I saw a hand before. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Hello, Felix. That's my name. And I was wondering, I know that the Decode project is running some prototypes in Barcelona and Amsterdam, I suppose. And I was wondering how the implementation process went so far, if you can talk a bit about that, and about which kind of challenges, so that ties probably into the previous question as well, it faced in actually empowering citizens in their data usage and control. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I got first the populism citizen movement question. So obviously, I mean, I'm talking from a narrative. I mean, when I talk about citizens, and in particular in the case of Barcelona, as you know, the mayor, for instance, that became, I mean, Barcelona is now governed by the first female mayor that was the leader of a popular movement. So she used to be the leader of the peoples collectively organizing for the right to housing. And she first created a kind of urban unionism, I would say, so a form of collective organizing around housing. And then because of the financial crisis and the housing crisis, housing became such a widespread and affordable housing problem that it wasn't anymore the kind of marginalized working class people that need a house, but it was basically the majority of the population, in particular middle class students and so on. And then they elected, they're in power, and in Spain we had a wave of creation of new political parties, Podemos, Barcelona en Comú, and other political parties that have been created because there wasn't a representation for these new forms of movements. So when I talk about citizens, I include, of course, movements, organized unions. I mean, unions, of course, have their problems in understanding this transformation, both of the labor market, but also of the informal economy, but also of the unorganized as defended by the labor union. So I think that there, you know, obviously it's required as well a transformation of the institutions to understand, you know, precarization and all the forms of precarization that we have. But obviously when I talk about the movement, I include organized collective, and when I talk about citizens, I include organized collective movements. But I think it's still important that we don't get the kind of right-wing populism to eat all of the instances, I mean, to make their own, all of the instances that could actually recuperate it by a progressive narrative, because otherwise, you know, the risk there is that we become the kind of comfortable, almost elite, you know, in which we are defending, you know, where we stand from, and the right-wing populists have it all, so they can, you know, also talk the conflict narrative, which I think should also belong to the progressives, right? So I think we should not be afraid of talking a bit populist as well. I mean, in a sense of advancing, you know, this progressive movement. But anyways, I take the point, and I think it should absolutely be clear that collective movements and collective forms of organization, labor, and so on are part of this bigger struggle. Systemic education policy, this is, I mean, absolutely, maybe you can also say some words. Of course, this is a big question. And I think this is a question also not only for cities. So we are trying to address this in a variety of ways. I think the most interesting for me is what we are doing with STEAM education in the curriculum of school, and in fact try to connect these kind of issues about new skills, new knowledge, the new digital skills, critical thinking, so combining STEM with arts and critical thinking, so humanities as well, and bring those new skills but also pedagogy of learning and methods of learning into the new curriculum of school. And I think this is something really exciting, and in Catalonia this is happening all across schools. But I think also we need education for the political class, and we need education for the managers. So we actually don't limit to education in school. We need executive education, and we need political class education on these issues, and maybe more awareness also. Regarding to Decode, yes, so we are running, actually yesterday we finished one of the big pilots of the Decode project in Barcelona, which is basically enabling Internet of Things data to be shared in a secure way. And we are involving citizen groups that are using sensors to monitor CO2 emissions and pollutions in cities. So basically it's called the Smart Citizen, and they built very low-tech kits which actually are used all around the world. And now we are enabling them with the Decode project to share this data in a secure way, so with privacy announcement, but also to decide with whom they want to share the data. Because what we're trying to pilot is a system where the citizen can say, I want to share my mobility data with the city of Barcelona, because in this way I can improve the public sector, but maybe I don't want to give this data to Uber or to an insurance company, and I can control this data. So this is the test that we're doing with them, and it's working, so we're very happy about that. And then it already integrates with Decidim Barcelona, which is our free software participatory democracy platform. Then now it's used by 60 cities around the world, and there is a lot of interest from nation states. So we have a lot of ambition for that platform, because we would like really to actually get for decentralized and free software platform for citizen participation, where citizens own the data and where there is security and privacy by design, to be the default platform, at least in Europe, and then maybe even beyond Europe, to do civic engagement. Because we really fear, I mean, otherwise we're going to complain about Cambridge Analytica type of situation for all our lives. Yeah. Because, I mean, civic engagement and political participation that happens on platforms that have as the core business model commercial manipulation of personal information and data, I think is dangerous for democracy. So that's why we are trying to shift and build alternatives like Decidim Barcelona, which now are scaling up, and they're working, and they're used all around the world. So I think these two pilots are really kind of happening, despite the fact that our engineers are now in Palo Alto. Now we have others that are working on the project. And at the moment, as we speak, actually there is a meeting in Amsterdam, because the city of Amsterdam is also testing the Decode technology, and they have a very interesting application on the decentralized identity management. And also there is the meeting of the coalition, Cities Coalition for Digital Rights, which is a coalition of cities that is backed by UN Habitat, that is now, globally happening, and Decode is part of these technologies for cities.
You want to comment on the education bit as
well? Sure, I will. I'll also start with Mariana, your question, and it's something I do need to constantly remind myself of, because as an urbanist, I tend to just, without thinking, start off with the city as the entry point. But of course, cities are deeply unequal. Of course, they're racialized. Of course, they're segregated. And these patterns reflect, what people do, right? Mill workers live in particular districts, or did live in particular districts. The colonial vision of the city determined spatiality, how cities were organized in some contexts deeply. And that has a recurrent impact on how people have organized or have not been able to organize. So of course, we need to be mindful of what the city is, but also how it's changing, because the city is never static. Things are constantly fluid, and that to me is not a technical question, it's a data question, but it's more a political question. Recognizing the types of change that are happening, not just in terms of the things we can touch, the infrastructure, but also in terms of service flows, right? Who's getting what or who's not getting what? Where are people living? Where is it safe for women to go? These are all deep, essentially political questions, and we do need to be mindful that we don't sort of just cast the urban lens in a way that hides these dynamics, but equally, there is an urban dimension to the big questions that you mentioned, Mariana. So of course, so cities account for, 60 or majority of the CO2 emissions. We need to figure out how or where we're going to get the concrete to build all of the homes that we need to accommodate the new urban population that's coming our way. There's some deeply urban dimensions to the big questions around climate change mitigation, the actions we need to take, and we won't get to the right answers unless we have that urban starting point. So, the stuff I was talking about in terms of incrementality, I think is quite a specifically urban thing, where you can't just raise a city and start again, right? You have to incrementally change things. And that's something that the urban discourse brings to you. In terms of education policies, again, I think the answer is small, not big. There's a lot of work done on thinking about pedagogy at the national level, at the city level, depending on local context. But to me, it's the small aspects of change in how people are learning about their environment that are quite meaningful. So I remember, one type of schooling that's quite popular in Mumbai is footpath schooling or sidewalks, right? So children that live in shanties are taught on the nearest pavement. And to me, it was quite eye-opening to think about how children in that space learn about their physical environment as opposed to in a concrete building, multi-story school. Right? They're almost closer to all of the class struggles we're talking about. They're on a sidewalk, right? Learning and trying to be citizens. And so introducing change at that level in small steps is quite meaningful. Working with slum dweller communities to understand why data is important was a question that was engaged with about 2 or 3 decades ago now, right? When it was becoming apparent that data was being used for evidence-based policy making in ways that was excluding people. Simple things like maps, city maps became deeply important because they used to have all of this detailed information and then suddenly a blank spot where the informal settlement was. There was no information on there. So what did they do? Loads of groups worked with slum dwellers to start putting pins on Google Maps. Right? That became their route to empowerment. And if you go to, walk through Google Maps in Lagos or Mumbai or or Nairobi, and you'll see these pins come up, and you'll see where the slum dwellers have been active to lay claim to their space that they've lived in. And you're absolutely right. The learning needs to happen at all levels, right? Because what happens is the demolition drives, for instance, are suddenly brought into play when people take notice of a particular area in a city. So they could be completely blind to a slum until that area becomes important in some way, right? It becomes monetized in some way. And then suddenly, overnight, these slum dwellers are made illegal. All of the learning that they've done about claiming their rights is pushed aside, and they're handed this notice saying, leave in 24 hours or we're going to... So small steps, but big impact.
Thanks. Next round of questions.
Hi, my name is Areli. I have, I guess, 2 questions. The first one is about, you were talking about how citizens are collecting data on air quality, and then how they are able to decide if they want to share or not this data. So my question is, where is this data being gathered? So every citizen has their own, I don't know, what? Like where do they archive this data? How do they own it?
Yeah.
So that's one question. And the second is, so we were been talking about sort of inverting the gaze, right? Not top button. Not top button.
Bottom up.
Yeah. So
top
we've
down.
been talking about bottom up.
What
So inverting the gaze. And but do you think this is sort of enough? How I guess the problem that I have is how do we, because even when you think about bottom up infrastructures, you are still sort of working with the same actors. Again, like maybe citizens and the state and sort of this type of actors. But what about when the state is not there? Like how do we invent or create new grammars or new infrastructures that kind of allow for these different types of data that are being collected in slums or to be taken into account? So that's the second question.
Next one is over there. Oh, over there, by the door.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a really interesting discussion, an important discussion. The topic of today was empowering citizens through data. And it feels like we've been discussing how we empower citizens by giving them control of their data. But maybe not so much how we empower them through data. Because, and you've actually questioned it a little bit, Jaideep, because what I'm seeing in my job is, because I work with data and citizens and public and private institutions, is that you can find data to support any statement. And we now see the people that have the hold of the data have the kind of power that economists used to have, because we're very comfortable with numbers. And if your idea makes more money than my idea, I'll invest in the one that makes more money. And now it's, well, if you can prove that putting a bike lane here is better than having a car lane here, then I'll invest in your bike lane. But if you can't do that, then I don't know how I feel about it. So it ultimately, even though it's data and it's numbers and it feels like we're making objective decisions, there is a strong values in data, and it's never objective. And I would be concerned that we're kind of entering a new realm now where data drives our decision making, but that we're still fundamentally not good enough at questioning actually our value system.
Very good question. Thanks. One more. Oh yeah, here, over here, gentleman in green. Shirt and pants.
Thank you. I want to ask a question which comes out of years of involvement with London and its planning and its housing. And because housing is one of the driving things behind the Barcelona project, it would be really interesting to have a Barcelona answer to this, but an answer from the Global South would be maybe even more useful. It's the following, that in some spheres of life, the data is very rich, and it keeps growing. Transport in particular. We know where every train is, every bus, every taxi. Everything can be tracked in real time. In the field of housing, this is less and less true. In the British case, which, and I'm being very parochial here because housing is always very parochial. In the British case, it used to be true that municipalities built housing and rented it out at council rents. We have institutions called housing associations. They used to build housing and rent it out at slightly higher rents on slightly less secure tenancies. And private developers would build housing to sell in the open market as freeholds or leaseholds. And all the statistics derived from that. You knew who built the stuff, you knew in what kind of tenure arrangement and what rent levels and prices it was being occupied. That was fine. Now all those categories have now dissolved. All these agencies are now free to build at any price, to change the price and tenure arrangements of what they own as it goes on. So gradually the data on all this disappears. We completely lost track of how the housing stock is being used. Now, short of having a very authoritarian registration system in which every individual has to declare their housing situation, the price they're paying, the rent they're paying, the tenure they're under, to the state or some public body, what the hell do we do? It's a complete nightmare. The city gets smarter in some areas and dimmer in others. So I just get worried stiff about this.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have 3 questions. Who wants to start?
Okay, maybe I get the where do you keep the data? And then I try to give you an answer, but it's a difficult question. Where do you keep the data? So in the model of Decode, because, so let's start from the real situation. The data is super centralized. It's kept in data silos, the big, data centers, which are either private or public, and they call them cloud, they call them data centers, and that's how data is kept. In our model that we are experimenting with Decode, the infrastructure is very decentralized and the data is kept locally. So it could be on your phone, it could be on some hardware that you have at home, or it could be just encrypted even on the cloud. But you have the keys and only you can decrypt this data. So, this is what we are experimenting. And now this integrates to the city infrastructure that it's more centralized, obviously. And we are betting that we are moving towards a more decentralized way, also because decentralized infrastructures are now spreading, and there is a lot of crypto and decentralization and so on. And so we could go in a model that's much more hybrid. The important thing is the cryptography around the data and your ability to control the data. So to decrypt and encrypt your data and to have the keys, if I make it simple. I think I want to add, being a bit of technocratic here, that what we have done in Barcelona that I think is very important is which also actually a bit links to your question, which I think is a very important question. But anyway, we have done a lot of work around procurement, which I think for public administration still could be the entry point of how to regain technological sovereignty. So what we have done in order to regain control over data is we introduced new clauses in public procurement contract that mandate any provider that win the public bids in Barcelona. It could be electric mobility, it could be waste management, telecom, whatever, to give back the data in machine-readable format to the city hall, and we create a license for this data that states that this data is in the public domain and it belongs to the citizens of Barcelona. So this is what we call data sovereignty. And underpinning these clauses, we also mandate for open standards, interoperability, privacy and security by design, and we try to reestablish some control over the urban infrastructure, the data urban infrastructure of the city. Of course, that doesn't answer to the question of what kind of questions you pose over the important thing is the questions, so the interpretation around data, but also all the institutional and power system around that. And this is why I stress so much, and the bottom up is, I'm not gonna, no, I'm not going to speak about any more bottom up because Mariana doesn't like it, but the question why I put at the very center citizen participation in the decision-making process is that we're trying to get away from this. We are the expert, the bureaucrat, the public officials that decide based on, the data and the power and this kind of objective facts. And you are the citizens that, you just are the data subject or the subject of the decision that will affect you. No, we have done processes where citizens were actively involved. So the decision is not objective and is not only taken by the bureaucrats. So you kind of open up also the process in which you evaluate what data for whom, who affects your policies based on the data that you use. Obviously, you cannot do that on every single thing, but you try to open up spaces for contestation also in the way that the data is interpreted and in the kind of questions that you ask about the data that you use. The housing question is super complicated, so a little bit I answer two things about what we've done in Barcelona to address that problem. I think Barcelona has even more problems than the one you have here. We have not even 2% of affordable housing and public housing in Barcelona, so this has been a huge crisis. We have created a municipal, actually it's a municipal extended to the metropolitan area, data office only for housing. So I've created a new municipal data office with 40 people, and a part of that has been dedicated only to the question of housing and creating new institutions around data for housing because we lost control. And also because the cities are actually asking more competence over the regulation of prices, like the ones they have in Berlin or even Paris and so on, that we don't have in Spain at the moment. And then one, I think, interesting policy that we've done was mandating 30% of the new builds to be affordable housing or public housing based on this new kind of data and analysis also over how the rent is changing. And just to your statement that it can only be authoritarian categorization of data, Airbnb has all this data. And that was the problem for us, that even that's why we started to introduce this kind of data sharing mandates when we negotiate with platforms, because basically Airbnb wouldn't give access to the data and also to the registry, and they have all the prices, all the household, everything, and we couldn't. You know what the answer to the municipality of Barcelona? They said, you can scrap our website. You know, so the problem was really regaining this kind of control over data and be able to do this kind of policies. Exactly. Well, this is a big issue.
So just quickly, completely agree with the sentiment of your question that data is political, and this example of housing data and how over time what we choose to recognize changes completely illustrates the point that absolutely data is political. What I did want to take issue with was that you framed it, your question on the absent state. You said, what if the state is absent? I don't think that's an if statement. I think that's an absolute positive statement, because the state is absent. The state is not able to currently completely provide all services, do all the planning, particularly from the context that I research. In fact, you know, the only real way of understanding the state is to look at archipelagos of service provision or state provision, right? Where you have, in a city, you have these little islands that are created where services are provided, but those islands, you know, they're not very distinct either. So some neighborhoods get water, others get electricity, and essentially residents jerry-rig into these main grids to figure out how they're going to live a better life. What we choose to recognize, what the state chooses to recognize, is a deeply political question. How we empower citizens through data, and I like that terminology, I think is a big question. It can't be answered lightly, but Francesca, your point on institutions is quite key here, because it's not the evidence for policies, it's the policies for evidence that's important here, because we're at, you know, just as we've created these islands of service provisions for water, for electricity, we're at the risk of creating those same islands when it comes to data because of the institutions, right? We're creating spaces that some people are completely included in and don't even think twice about it, but others are absolutely excluded from it. On just very briefly on the housing question, I mean, this is something that is a question that deeply troubles me, because homelessness and the crisis of affordable housing is, you know, as we've said earlier, just absolutely connects North and South. It's very real, very present in almost every urban context that you can imagine. So it's a big question. And you're right, we have blind spots in our data. The same blind spots, and here we can actually learn from what's going on in informal settlements, for instance, because the same types of blind spots exist, right? The state essentially doesn't know who lives or how they share. You know, often there's 2 or 3 families cohabiting, there's mixed use, right? There's a business operating on the bottom floor, there's a cantilever kind of mezzanine floor where the family lives. It's a blind spot. Unfortunately, technology hasn't helped, right? So the technological solution to mapping slums is to send drones. Right? That's been the way to quickly map vast urban areas. How does a drone recognize when there's two different families living in a shanty? Well, the way that slum dwellers, and I keep coming back to this, right? Slum dwellers know their own reality. Ask them. Let them conduct their own surveys. Why are cities not trusting of data that citizens collect themselves? Right? Go into public provided housing. Go into these housing estates. Ask them, what is your reality? What works? What doesn't work? Why do we have to treat data that comes from a lab or somehow from a sensor as somehow more objective than something that somebody's telling you about their own reality? And there's a flip side to this question too. Because what do you do, or what does the state do? And I don't think this question's answered, so I'm posing it. What does the state do when people themselves want to remain invisible for reasons of persecution? They're refugees.
Well, with
in
Facebook
sanctuary.
Libre, this is not going to be possible
right?
anymore. Sorry.
But what do we do? So that is a question. If people, and maybe blockchain cryptography is a solution there. But I don't think we have the right answers yet in terms of policy making.
Yeah, I think there are so many questions we didn't actually tackle today at all. And unfortunately, I said the timer is out, so we have to finish it here, although I think there's many questions that you all have. But the bar is open, so feel free to approach our speakers today. And I would like to just close by, if you think back, we started from what has changed for a citizen in the digital age? And I think the answer is nothing really, because it actually reinforces all the 2,000-year-old questions about politics, institutions, economy. So in the same way as we still laugh at Greek comedy, politics is still important, economy still matters, and institutions still matter. So we just have to reinvent them for the digital age. So that's all for you as citizens. That's the homework. Until next week, come back with some solutions. And thank you.
Well done.